and welcome to lesson number 5 of My God Defining the Divine, His Paradoxes. Tonight's class is being dedicated in honor of the complete refuah shalema and miraculous recovery of Henya Bas Bracha Dvaralea, right? That this learning should rise up before God and be a good interceder on behalf of her and her family. Arlene, you want to say something?
You said it.
Okay. So last week, we had a slight diversion from the topic that we'd been discussing the weeks earlier. The first few weeks, the focus is, what is the nature of God? How could we understand God better? Last week, we moved away from that a little bit, and we talked about our relationship, our connection with God. We are going back this week to learn more about God's nature, and we're going to ask 4 really great questions. Question number 1, can God create a rock that he can't lift? Question number 2, does God's foreknowledge preclude our free choice? Question number 3, is there anything that God finds difficult to do? And question number 4, if God has decided to do something, can we change his mind? So we will begin with question number 1. Can God create a rock that he can't lift? This is one of the all-time great classical, philosophical, theological questions, and it takes many modern forms. They can be divided up into 2 different categories. There are creation-related, and then there are God-related. So just to give a few modern ways of looking at it, from a creation-related perspective, can God fit an elephant through the eye of a needle? This is without shrinking the elephant and without enlarging the eye of the needle. Another version, can God cause a person to travel north and south at exactly the same time? Can a person board a train and remain on the platform at the same time? Can a person win a chess match with one move and yet still can still be confined to the rules of the game? Can God make 2 + 2 = 5? You can come up with your own version of the question, but the point is, if God can do anything, can God do the impossible? Within the confines, within the limits of creation, can God fit an elephant through the eye of a needle? But then we have, yes?
You're asking God cheat?
You could call it whatever term you want. You could call it cheat if you like. The question is, does God have the ability to do so? Or do we say that God is somehow constrained or limited? Call it a miracle. Call it cheating. Call it anything you want. Is it something that is within the realm of possibility to be done? So this is in the realm of within creation, right? Does God have the ability to do the impossible? And in Hebrew philosophical terminology, it's called nimna hamnimnoyos, right? Which means, can he do the absolute impossible? God-related, can he limit himself and still be infinite? We know God is an infinite being, but what if he chooses to limit himself? Does that somehow make him not an infinite being anymore? How about this one? This is one of my favorites. Can God replicate himself? And if he does, will he still be 1? Or will he then be 2? Can he make himself unable to do something and still be omnipotent, all-powerful? And then, of course, the classic version of that question is, can he create a rock that he himself cannot lift? So let's try to answer the question, and we're going to answer it from 3 different perspectives. We're going to begin with the classic rationalist response. The approach of the rationalists within Judaism is that God can do what is physically impossible. That means God can create miracles. Is it physically possible to split the Red Sea? I cannot do it, right? Even Bill Nye, the science guy, he probably also cannot do it. It is a physically impossible thing. However, God can do things that are physically impossible. He made bread rain from the sky. He split the sea before us, and there were dozens, if not hundreds, of miracles that we have throughout the biblical miraculous era. So absolutely, God can do what is physically impossible. That is called a miracle. The rationalistic approach certainly goes along with it. However, from a rationalist perspective, they say God cannot do what is logically impossible. What is logically impossible? 2 + 2 to equal 5. God cannot do that. But you would argue, but God is infinite. God can't be limited. God can't be constrained. Yes, but 2 + 2 is stupid, right? Without saying it in a more refined way. It doesn't matter that God can't do that. That doesn't take away something from God, because that's something which is ludicrous. It's something which is ridiculous. You can't be writing something and not writing something. It's an illogical impossibility. You cannot fit an elephant through the eye of a needle. Look at the way that the Rambam portrays this in text number 1. Fred, would you like to begin with text number 1? It is on page up there at the top. Okay. In the middle. Remove all pinned videos. Oh boy. Okay. I'll see if I could get rid of that. Hold on a second. I may or may not be able to get rid of it. It does not look like I'm going to be able to get rid of it. Just one of those things. Okay, but that's where is I don't know where it is to be able to get rid of it. That's the problem. Okay. I hope that is not too frustrating for you on the screen over here, but I'll try to read everything that is on here as well. Again, the technology. I want to know who's doing this to me. If you let me know, we're gonna figure it out. Okay. So what page is text number 1 on here? All right, page 142. Please go for it.
The inability to accomplish something that is imperfection. We would not help someone weak if we were unable to lift 1,000 talents. So too, we do not consider God to be imperfect because he can't transform himself into a body.
So an illogical absurdity is not considered to be a limitation to God. That's not how it works. If you say that a person is the strongest person in the world, but they cannot physically lift up the Empire State Building and carry it around, that in no way, shape, or form takes away from them the title of being the strongest person in the world, because it makes no sense to have a human being be able to lift up the Empire State Building. Similarly, you can't say that it's a limitation that God cannot make this thing happen. It's illogical. We cannot apply the concept to God. This is the approach of the Rambam, the rationalist approach to Judaism. Can God create a rock that he can't lift? Of course he can't do that, because it makes no sense. The whole thing makes no sense. So the question doesn't even get off the ground. However, there's a different approach is taken by the mystics, the more spiritual, the more Kabbalistically inclined, which is, do not limit God to the rational. Don't limit God. We cannot place any type of limitation on God. The fact that we can't fathom how that would work, that's our problem. That's not God's problem. God can do the impossible. Can God create a rock that is too heavy for him to lift? Yes. Can we understand that in our own mind that makes any sense? No, but it doesn't matter, because we are limited. God is not. God is the architect of human logic, not its prisoner. Let's go to text number 2. I don't want to read the entire text number 2, just one little section in the middle. Arlene, would you like to read this? Begin with the second paragraph, and I'll tell you when to stop.
The truth is that no one would deny the truth and accept it on faith unless he was those who deny the possibility of anything that is naturally or physically impossible. Those who say that the impossible is impossible, even for God, it is as if they assert that nothing transcends their own life.
Right, good stop there. So the Rashba says people, right, who say that God cannot do that, it's because they are limiting God's ability to our own logic. We have to recognize that God transcends our own logic. God created our own logic. Can God create a rock that he can't lift? Yes. We don't understand it because it makes no sense within our world. But we can't limit God. We can't put him in a box. God is able to do the impossible. What do you think the Hasidic approach is? The Hasidic approach is, very simply, both are correct, right? Both are right. How is it possible that both of these approaches are right? It's very simple. We know that God is inherently unconstrained. God is infinite. God is transcendent. God absolutely can do everything and anything that's impossible, that makes no sense in our world. However, what did God do? He chose to constrain himself. What does that mean? That means, of course, God can create a rock that is impossible for him to lift because God is transcendent, he is infinite, he can do anything. However, God created a world where God does limit and constrain himself to the limitations of the world. So therefore, within the context of the world, no, God cannot, because that is illogical. So both are true at the same time. From the perspective of God's essence, yes, God can do anything. From the perspective of the limitations that God placed in the world, then no. So in fact, both answers are correct. Let's go to text number 3, the Rebbe's words. Mitchell, please.
All the rules of logic were created by God. It follows that he who created these rules is not constrained by them. God forbid. As Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet wrote in his known with content, it is impossible for anything to be impossible for God. When certain Jewish philosophers claim that some possibilities are impossible, even for God, they were referring to God as he chooses to confine himself to the rules of logic.
So you might think that the rationalist and the mystic disagree, right? They argue, totally different view of Judaism. The Rebbe demonstrates that no, right? That in fact, both of them are true, just looking at the world from perhaps a different angle, and the Hasidic approach synthesizes them quite beautifully. But the Rebbe continues and actually says that this is not theoretical. It's not theoretical that God can create a rock that he can't lift. We actually have a demonstration of God doing the impossible, the illogical, in this very world, and he proves it from the Torah. What do you think is the example in creation that God uses that the Rebbe uses to prove this point? What did God create that is a physical manifestation of the impossible, the infinite and the finite merging in this world? The ark in the temple. Allow me to demonstrate. The Aron occupied space. It had very precise dimensions. The Torah says it was, I believe, 1.5 cubits by 1.5 cubits by 2.5 cubits. If it was off by 1 millimeter, it would no longer have that measurement. It would be absolutely not kosher. Right. I'm just going to pause for 1 second. I've done that before. To plug in this tablet with the battery. We'll just take 1 second. We plug it in, and we'll be good to go. This is the longest extension cord I've ever seen. We are back. Again, that thing is still on the screen. I have no idea why. Okay. So we have the ark. It occupies space. It has precise dimensions. If the dimensions are off, it simply would not be kosher. In order for it to be an ark, it has to have the precise dimensions. Now, the Torah tells us that the space of the Holy of Holies was 20 cubits. If you measure from one side to the other side, 20 cubits. However, if you measured from the wall to the ark, it was 10 cubits. And you measured from the other side of the ark to the other, it was 10 cubits. Which means that the ark physically took up space and it physically did not take up space at the same time. You could literally measure the ark, it's 2.5 cubits wide. Yet on one side is 10, on the other side is 10. If you went wall to wall, it was 20. So we have a physical manifestation of God's transcendent infinite ability to actually manifest itself and express it in this world. The impossible and the possible taking place in the location of the ark. So that's an example in creation. But what about an example in God himself? Every creature in the universe is under God's control, except for one thing. There's one thing that God did create that he cannot lift. It's not a rock. What is it? Exactly. God created something that he can't lift, and that is each and every one of us. That is us. God cannot control humans because they have free will. He cannot lift us. It is up to ourselves to lift ourselves. Now we're going to show a brief video which expresses this idea quite beautifully.
1956, Rosh Hashanah, the Tashlich ceremony, where we cast away the burdensome sins of the past year, is performed beside a body of water. For years, the Lubavitcher Rebbe would embark on a 1-mile walk to the lake in the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, an entourage of dancing Hasidim at his side. But this year, there is an autumn downpour. The Brooklyn streets are empty. Undeterred, the Rebbe walks into the storm. The march goes on. The Hasidim arrive at the park, only to find the gates closed and locked. After all, who would visit the gardens in the midst of the rainstorm? Swiftly, the Rebbe begins to scale the 8-foot metal barricade. He reaches the top, leans over, and descends on the other side. And then he beckons to the drenched Hasidim, as if to say, "Join me." All the Hasidim, young and old, strong and frail, climb over the wall. The prayer is recited, and the Rebbe begins to sing. The assembled break into joyous dance. The Hasidim return in the rain. Their fedoras drip with dissolved ink, staining their holiday clothes. Back in the warm confines of 770, the Rebbe pours wine for all those who had scaled the barricade. There is joy and exhilaration, because the Rebbe has revealed something in those who had joined the daring expedition. No wall can stand between a Jew and their desire to become close to God. No barricade is unscalable. You will never know the things you are capable of, the limitless nature of your soul, until you begin to climb. Because in every mortal body beats an immortal piece of God. You are as limitless as the God who resides within you.
A very powerful message there about the infinite capabilities that God placed in each and every one of us. So, can God create a rock that he can't lift? Nothing is impossible for God. Yet he chooses to confine himself to the constraints of logic. Now, for those of you who are watching on the recording, I'm going to pause for just another second because I want to see if I can actually get rid of that from the screen, because I have to imagine that's a little frustrating. All right, I think I know what to do. It is gone, right? What? You got a picture on picture? Okay. There we go. Okay. Now I just need to pull up the right screen on here. And I fixed it. Now, if I could figure out why in the first place that happened, I have no idea. But I just decided to pop up. I have no idea why I decided to ask that question. Okay, I'm gonna fire the video engineer. Question number 2, right? Does God's foreknowledge preclude our free choice? Now, we all know that free choice is absolutely a pillar of Judaism. It's what makes what we do meaningful. If we did not have any free choice, then nothing that we did can be attributed to us, not for the good and not for the bad. So free choice is an absolute foundational pillar of Judaism. It says in the Torah, I've set before you life and death. God implores us, God begs us, please choose life. But at the end of the day, it's up to us. But how does this work with God's foreknowledge of our choices? For God, the past, the present, the future, ultimately is all one. God created time. He's not limited by it. Therefore, he already knows everything that we did. If what we have done is already inscribed and sealed and written in a book, then how is it that we can have free choice? It seems to be destined. It's preordained. It's already happened on a certain degree. So how do we answer that question? So we're going to go to text number 5. Very beautifully written by Rabbi Moshe Almosnino, 16th century rabbi, but also scientist, right, physicist. Text number 5. Eileen, please.
Here's an analogy that suppose I see not is certainly running, keep running, held by my knowledge and observation of his running. Although my knowledge is absolute, his running is by choice. The same applies to divine knowledge. God's foreknowledge of our choices doesn't compel our choices because God transcends time and our future is his present. Just as our knowledge of current events doesn't compel those events, so does his knowledge of our future choices not compel our choices.
So this is explained quite beautifully, logically. Knowledge of a choice doesn't necessarily compel the choice. The fact that Hashem knows what we're going to do because Hashem knows the future doesn't impact our ability to freely choose it now. It happens to be that God's knowledge works a little bit differently than ours. For God, our future is God's present. So God knows what we will choose, not because he predetermined our choice. That's not why God knows. That's not how God knows. God knows because he sees what we'll choose. The same way I can see what you're doing now didn't force me to, didn't force you to make that choice. It happens to be that God's present is our future. That's it. So it really is not that complicated at all. Principle number 19 already. Does God's foreknowledge preclude our free choice? God's foreknowledge isn't the cause of our choice. It's the outcome of our choice. So a very important distinction. We absolutely have free will. The fact that God knows the future does not impact our ability to choose at all. Let's go to question number 3. Is there anything that God finds difficult to do? To answer this question, let's think about the process with which God created the world. How did God choose to create the world? What is the metaphor that the Torah uses? Anyone know? God spoke and created the world, right? God said, let there be light, and there was light. So the Torah describes the process of God creating the world. The creation account stresses that God spoke the universe into being. Why all the talking? Why doesn't the Torah say, and God made it, he created it, he did it, he formed it, he shaped it? We have some of those words there a little bit, But the primary mode of expression is God created the world through speech. So the Medrash gives us a little bit of an explanation. Text number 6. Jim, would you like to read text number 6?
Sure. The word of God, the heavens were made. Rabbi Yehuda bar Simon said, God created his world without toil or exertion. Rather, there was the world of God, and already the heavens were made.
So the Medrash tells us that one of the reasons why God chose to create the world with speech is to let us know that God created his world without toil or exertion. The same ease, the same effortlessness it is for us to speak, to say something, to communicate any message, that's the effort that it took for God to create the world. Humans operate differently. For human beings, there's something we can do, and then there's things that we can't do. And then there are things that we can do with great difficulty. It's hard. For God, there's no such thing. For God, creation is effortless. The concept of something being difficult simply cannot apply to God. Yes, Mitchell.
That goes to the philosophical question. There's no way to hear it.
How does it relate to that question? How do you know it's? How do you know it was said? I'm not sure I understand your question.
That God spoke.
Yes.
That means God had to say something that's true. No other person would be able to hear it.
So that's a great question. So for a second, I thought you were asking the great philosophical question, right? That if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? Right? That's what I thought you were asking. And that's a very interesting question. But Mitchell was asking the question. It says that God spoke, but if there was no one around to hear it, right, what does that mean? So what the Medrash really is saying is God did not speak. God doesn't have a voice. He doesn't have a throat. He doesn't have a mouth. This is language that the Torah is using to convey a message to us. Why does God create the world through speech? One of the messages is, just as for a human being, speech is effortless, so too for God creating the world, it was also effortless. Right? Now, the metaphor of speech teaches us many other things, but this is one of them that the Medrash says. Speech, not because someone did or didn't hear it, rather, it's to teach us it's effortless. The concept of something being difficult cannot apply to God. Yet our sages actually use the exact words that there are certain things that is difficult for God to do multiple times. Let's go to text number 7a in the Talmud. Sandy, if you would like to read text number 7a, please unmute yourself and go for it. And you could go for 7a and 7b. I'll give you a few more seconds to see if you're able to unmute yourself and go for it. If not, I will call on somebody else. All right, no worries, Sandy. Fredlin, would you like to read it? Thank you.
Rabba Bar Anna says that Rabbi Yochanan says it is difficult for God to match a couple together. It is as difficult for God to match a couple together as was the splitting of the Red Sea.
So we have here in this text some exceptions. Before we said it's impossible to say anything is difficult for God. Yet in this text, we have exception number 1, splitting of the Red Sea. That was difficult for God. Exception number 2, matchmaking. That was difficult for God. And now, please, Fredlin, continue with text 7b for the third exception.
Providing a person's livelihood is as difficult for God as the splitting of the Red Seas. For it says, He provides food to all flesh. And nearby is the verse, to him who divided the Red Sea into parts.
So the Talmud adds that in addition to splitting of the sea and matchmaking, providing sustenance for each and every person on earth is also very difficult for God. So we need to understand, first of all, how is it possible that anything can be difficult for God? How can anything be hard for God? The Torah clearly testifies that the creation of the entire universe and everything in it was effortless. Nothing can be difficult for Hashem. So how can we say these things are difficult? Or so how can you say anything is difficult? And why these three things? What is so specific about these three things that make it difficult for God? So let's go to the Zohar, text number 8. Arlene, please.
When God will do something, all before him is as naught, and how faith to stand in his place. Yet to say that the splitting of the sea, when God desired to split the sea for the Jewish people, Rahab, the archangel of Egypt, protested. That's the universe. Why did you take justice upon the Egyptians or split the sea for the Jews? They are all guilty before you. They both serve idols. They have both committed sexual wrongs. They have both committed murder. Aren't your ways just and true?
It continues.
As that moment, it was difficult for God to override.
So the Zohar explains for us what is the circumstances when God is going to, so to speak, find something difficult. Because we know, of course, it's impossible to say that something's difficult for God. But when the Torah uses the terminology that something is difficult for God, what's happening? So the Zohar explains that God interacts with the world in two models. Model number one is the model of justice, midas hadin. Midas hadin means he's particular. Misdeeds require penalties. There are consequences. If you are playing on your phone at work all day, you're going to get fired. That's how it works. It doesn't matter how handsome you are. It makes no difference. If you do not do the job that you are hired to do, there's going to be a consequence for your actions. It's a system of rules. It's a system of regulation. And that's one of the ways that God runs the world and interacts with the world. If you're wrong, there's going to be a penalty. There's going to be a consequence. But then there's another model. The model is mercy, midas harachamim, divine attribute of mercy. God is merciful. God is forgiving of misdeeds. This would be like a parent-child. The parent loves the child. The parent is going to be much more willing to give second chances to their child. If their child is playing with their phone at work, the parent is going to give them a second chance a lot quicker than if the person playing on their phone was just an employee. So there are two ways that God could be operating with the world. Either strict rules and regulations and justice, or with compassion, with mercy, like a loving parent. Now let's go to the splitting of the sea. The incident which is considered to be the major difficult event. What does the splitting of the Red Sea and the drowning of the Egyptians represent? Is this justice or is this mercy? This is justice, right? The Egyptians, which enslaved the Jewish people, who murdered the Jewish people, the taskmasters that beat the Jewish people on a daily basis, they were cruel. They got exactly what they deserved. They were drowned in the sea. This was an expression of justice. The Egyptians needed to be punished. However, what did the angels say? The angels say these Jewish people, they are just as guilty. They sank into the 49th level of impurity. So low, one more day in Egypt, they would not have been redeemable, period. Every form of immorality, the Jews embraced and engaged with, just as the Egyptians as well. So the angel said to God, according to rules and regulations, the Jews deserved to be buried under the Red Sea, just like the Egyptians. But what did God do? God invoked his attribute of mercy to save the Jewish people. But we had a conflict. There were two modes to operate in, either justice mode or mercy mode. What did God do? God simultaneously employed and overrode his attribute of justice. So this is what the sages mean when they say it was difficult. Difficult is trying to communicate to us that difficult means an out of the ordinary action featuring dueling forces simultaneously. So why is the splitting of the sea difficult for God? Not because it requires some type of a superhuman efforts. Anything is effortless to God. But what does it represent? It represents opposites taking place at the same time. When God has to use his attribute of justice and his attribute of mercy at the same time, that is considered to be, so to speak, difficult for God to do. God is blending, uniting, merging things which normally would be completely opposite. Chassidus looks at it slightly differently. It uses a very similar model, but I think takes the whole thing to another level. We said before that there are two ways that God operates the world: the attribute of mercy and the attribute of justice. What is difficult when both of them, which are opposite features, have to be expressed at once. Chassidus says, yes, there's two ways that God operates within the world, but two different ways. One is the fact that God is infinite, that God is completely transcendent. The second manner is that God is finite and expresses himself within the confines and the limitations of the world. What does it mean that God expresses himself in a limited way in the world? How does that manifest itself in creation itself? Number one, the laws of nature are maintained. Even though God is transcendent, even though God is infinite, when God expresses himself within the world, it is according to and limited by the rules of nature. That is how God runs the world. And number two, God's presence is concealed. So God, the way he runs the physical world, he runs it according to nature, and his presence is hidden. What happened at the splitting of the Red Sea? Both of those principles were overridden because the infinite, transcendent God was now expressing itself in the world. Number one, the laws of nature were suspended. Typically, water flows. It does not split and form solid walls or tunnels. So the very nature of the world changed. And number two, right, God's presence was revealed to the entirety of the Jewish people. The Talmud tells us that even a non-Jewish maid who was accompanying the Jews through the splitting of the Red Sea was able to see, witness, and experience what even the greatest prophets, the prophet Yecheskel, was not able to perceive. We have the greatest depictions of prophecy, the divine chariot. We read it on Shavuos when the Ten Commandments are read. We read it on, it's the Haftorah for the portion where the Torah was given. What was seen at the splitting of the Red Sea, even the greatest of prophets did not merit to be able to see. So when the infinite and the finite merge, that is the depiction of something that is difficult, so to speak. When the transcendent and the immanent express itself, that is God doing something that's difficult. Now let's apply this principle to matchmaking and to making a livelihood. So when it comes to making a livelihood, God breaks rules so that the undeserving receive blessing. If we would have to truly be worthy to merit God's sustaining us, nobody would be meritorious. In the Unas Anatokah prayer that we say on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, what does it say? We all stand before God in judgment. Nobody is going to be meritorious. Think of what it is that God demands of us and the amount of time simply that we waste, right? No one is going to come out looking completely squeaky clean and shining. So number one, God breaks the rules in order to sustain all of us. And at the same time, these blessings materialize in our limited world. God does not miraculously provide our needs. It's not manna falling from heaven. It's somehow within the confines, within the rules and regulations, within the limitations of nature, God has a way to provide us for our needs. So it's the infinite and the finite merging in our livelihood. We are unworthy, yet God gives it to us. Yet he gives it to us miraculously, but through nature, where his presence can't even be concealed. And then finally, we have the concept of matchmaking. God transcends differences between people to unite them in marriage. There is perhaps nothing more difficult than pairing two people together, because man and women are opposites. Men and women are so different to each other that you could say men are from Mars, women are from Venus. One of my favorite books, fabulous book to help you understand the differences between men and women. From the perspective men are from Mars and women are from Venus, 1 + 1 equals 2. 2 different people. From the perspective of the Torah, from the perspective of marriage, what does marriage accomplish? 1 + 1 equals 1. That is what marriage is all about. That's what matchmaking is all about. And so therefore we could understand why the Torah would describe that as something difficult. So whenever God is bringing together two opposites into one, the Torah uses the terminology of difficult for us to comprehend that it's the finite and the infinite, the transcendent and the immanent merging at the same time. So is there anything that God finds difficult to do? Nothing is essentially difficult for God. However, an act of God that simultaneously features dueling divine energies is called difficult. All right, any questions, comments on anything that we've discussed so far? All right, we will move to the final question. Question number 4. If God has decided to do something, can we change his mind? Now, Mr. Cohen and Mr. Levy, very good friends. They did a lot of business together, and they were avid golfers. Absolutely loved playing golf. Mr. Cohen says to Mr. Levy, I have absolutely fabulous news for you. I was able to book an incredible businessman, tremendously successful, a person that we've been trying to meet for ages to play golf with us. Saturday morning, 10 a.m., meet us at the golf course, greatest business opportunity ever. And Mr. Levy says, I'm sorry, I can't make it. It's Shabbos, and I'm going to be in Shul. Says, what? You're going to Shul? Since when do you go to Shul on Shabbos? I said, listen, Mr. Goldstein, you know Mr. Goldstein? Wealthiest guy in the community. The most phenomenally successful business person we know. He goes to Shul every single Shabbos, and he says that is the secret of his success. So again, Mr. Cohen looks at Mr. Levy and he says, you are going to Shul to talk to God? He says, no, I'm going to Shul to talk to Mr. Goldstein. Right? If God has decided something, can we change his mind? The answer, of course, is yes, of course. That is what the whole concept of prayer is all about. If we could not change God's mind, then prayer would simply be a pointless exercise, and it might be better off being on the golf course on a Shabbos morning at 10 a.m. Yet, yet, if you look at some biblical verses, what do we see? We see that it says in the book of Bamidbar, it's actually Bilam talking to Balak. He says, nor is he immortal that he should have a change of heart. Bilam says to Balak, you're talking about God. You think you're going to change his mind? You're thinking it'll impact him? Impossible. He's not a human being that's moody, that responds to petitions. God, you cannot change his mind. Yet we also see in the Torah, this is regarding the story of the flood. It says God regretted that he made humans upon the earth. This would appear to be God changing his mind. So what's the story? God doesn't change his mind. God does change his mind. Which one is it? So, as I said, of course, God changes his mind. But what are the circumstances? What are the rules? How exactly does this work when God changes his mind? So the first thing that we have to appreciate is It's not that God changed his mind. It's that the circumstances have changed. For example, in a situation of prayer, a person has a need, a person has a want. God may have decided that you are not worthy, that you don't merit it. It's something that's not in the cards. It's not part of your destiny. However, you may change as a person. You may appeal before God as a changed person. You're a different person than the person you were the day before. You changed your lifestyle. You changed your attitude. You're communicating to God in a different way. Circumstances have changed. Yesterday, it wasn't happening. It wasn't in the cards. You weren't worthy. Today, it's a totally different circumstance. It's not that God changes his mind. It's part of the very fabric and the plan and purpose of the universe. That if you act in Avenue A, there's going to be one scenario. But if the circumstances change, and now it's circumstance B, then of course, God is going to change. The Rambam explains this idea a little bit in a very interesting area of the Torah. We know that it's a mitzvah to listen to a prophet, but how do you know who's the real prophet? How do you know who is an authentic prophet? So the Torah says it's a very simple test that you do. He has to be able to predict the future. If you could predict whether Bitcoin will go up, prophet, right? If not, you can't. If a person can predict the future, something that it's impossible that any regular human being would be able to know, you believe the person, and the person is a prophet. Now, what if it doesn't come true? Person gets up and says, I'm a prophet, God has communicated to me, therefore you must listen to me. You ask him to predict the future, he predicts the future, and it's a failure. It's a bust. Do we get rid of them? Is it the death penalty? The Rambam explains that it depends. If what the prophet was predicting will take place was bad and negative, if it does not come true, no impact. No impact at all. Why? Because someone might have done tshuva. God is now compassionate and merciful. That negative decree is wiped out. However, if he predicts something good, and that does not happen, you know he's a charlatan and a crook. Because when God makes a decision for something good, there is no going back. There is no changing his mind. That is locked in forever. Let's go to text number 14. Mitchell, I think we're up to you. Text number 14.
Nor do we say, look, or not fulfilled. This is God, clothing, abundance, having a change of heart, regarding peace, enigmas. It is possible that the intended recipients of prophecy repented and they were forgiven, as was the case with the people of Nineveh, or that the retribution will be, as was the case with the Hezekiah. However, a prophet foretold that good would come, such and such was occurred, and the good that was prophesied did not materialize. This is merely a false prophet. For any good that God decreed, even if the decree is conditional, will never be fulfilled.
So the Rambam explains that God can have a change of heart regarding meting out punishment. Something negative, you change, the circumstance changes, God is compassionate, merciful, and kind, and that can be averted. But when God has a thought to act with justice, right, there is the possibility for an override. But for the good, locked in. Never going to change. It's locked in forever. So principle number 21, if God has decided to do something, can we change his mind? God doesn't change his mind, but sometimes the circumstances change. And there's always a possibility to change his mind from acting with justice.
Lesson 5. His Paradoxes. 1. According to the Jewish mystics, God, who created logic, is the architect of its constraints, not its prisoner. He can not only do the impossible, but also the unthinkable. 2. God is timeless, and to him, the future is present. His foreknowledge isn't the cause of our choice. It is the outcome of his observation of our choice. 3. The concept of something being difficult or challenging cannot apply to God. Nevertheless, when God simultaneously employs dueling divine forces, that is out of the ordinary and termed difficult. 4. A timeless God who knows all that will transpire in the future can't have a change of heart. Sometimes, however, God determines from the outset that first he will take one course of action, and later he'll change course. 5. When God determines to act with kindness, no mechanism can change that. From the outset, that is the only possible outcome. However, when God has a thought to act with justice, included in the original thought is always the possibility of changing God's mind and bringing about a kinder result.
As always, I highly recommend you go to myjli.com/mygod with our further readings, videos, articles, lectures that will expand your understanding of the topic of this class. And of course, please look at your student textbook at the end of each lesson. There's a phenomenal amount of material. Next week, lesson number 6, we're going to wrap up this whole discussion about God with 4 more principles regarding our relationship with God. And just looking forward to the next course, which is going to begin in the first week of February, possibly even February 1st. It's called Book Smart, Course Through Judaism's Most Important Titles and the Authors Who Inscribe Them. So we're going to go through some of the most important, prominent books within Jewish history. So we'll learn a little bit about the authors, why they're so significant, why they're meaningful, and how they contributed to the development of Judaism throughout history. So a really fascinating course that's coming up in February. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I look forward to seeing you next week.